Hi, fourth graders. We are going to start in the textbook about learning about the United States, and it is Unit 1. And I know this sounds silly, but it's going to be pages 0 to 5 in the textbook, States and Regions. So here is page 0, and there's an image that says Unit 1, and you'll see mountains with snow on them and trees and flat land. And you're going to notice that we are looking at a timeline on the bottom of the page. And if you're in the textbook, the timeline runs across the bottom of 4 pages. And a timeline runs from earliest to greatest, and you have to pay close attention to the intervals. So on this page, the intervals of time are 100 years. So we start at 1500, then we go to 1600, then we go to 1700. And it's almost like a number line or a ruler. Obviously, you go in order from least to greatest, and then in between, there are going to be lines or dots that may not be on 1500. Like I'm looking at the timeline right now, it says 1605. So you're going to notice that the dot is very close to 1600, but it's not exactly on 1600, because if there were little hash lines in between each one, 1605 would be a smidge off of 1600. So I'm going to read to you each little blurb on the timeline. So on 1500 at the top, in the United States, at the top in blue, we have explorers and settlers begin to arrive in North America. Now, this is very important. Pay close attention to the information in this timeline, because at the end of the slideshow, there is a slide that has a link on it to a Google form. You can refer back to this information. You can refer back to this slideshow, but you need to know this information to be able to be successful on the Google form. So pay close attention. So as I was saying, in the 1500s in the United States, explorers and settlers begin to arrive in North America. In the 1600s in the United States, on the top of the timeline, European settlers and African workers arrive in large numbers. So now at the same time, below the timeline, in 1500, Benin is the most powerful kingdom in Western Africa. And then in 1605, India is united under the Mughal Empire. So in the top of the timeline, we're talking about the United States. On the bottom of the timeline, we're talking about at the same time around the world. At the top, 1787 in the United States, at the top of the timeline, we have, as a new nation, the United States writes its Constitution. So in 1787, the United States writes its Constitution. But below, around the world, in 1795, just a few years later, China reaches its greatest size under the king rulers. I hope I said that right. So now we're moving along in intervals from 1800 to 1900. Above in the United States in the blue, in 1920, more Americans live in cities than on farms. So they're living in a rural area, they're living in an urban area, not a rural area, because we know that cities are in an urban area and farms are a rural area. So below, in 1918, World War I ends in Europe. So that's the dark blue at the bottom. That's what's going on in the world. So now above, present, it says more than 300 million people live in the United States. Can you believe that? That number is so large, and it's probably even more now. Below, around the world, in the present time, more than 6 billion people live on Earth. So you know in math we are studying place value. So if you plug those in, 6 billion is greater than 300 million. So now we're going to continue on page 2. Page 2. We're going to be focusing on Native Americans, the first wave and the second wave. So if you look up at the top, we're talking about people. So on the left-hand side of the page, and I would call it either dark blue or purple, we're talking about Native Americans. Native Americans are the first people to live in the Americas. They had many different ways of life and spoke many different languages. Native Americans, they used natural resources around them for food, clothing, and shelter. So now we know that natural resources are things or resources that come from nature. They use the natural resources for food, clothing, and shelter. So now I'm looking at the second group of words with the 2 bullet points, and it says first wave. Early 1600s to about 1750. So that's 150 years. People from England and other European countries settled the Atlantic coast. People from Spain settled in the Southwest and in Florida. And enslaved Africans arrived. So now I'm looking down at the picture that's labeled number 2. And this is an example of what the people might have looked like during the first wave. Notice their clothing, notice the hats they're wearing. So that's during the first wave from early 1600s to about 1750. So now I'm looking at the green paragraph and it says second wave. So there was the Native Americans, then the first wave of people, now the second wave of people. So from 1820 to 1870, more than 7 million people arrived. Many people from Germany and Ireland settled the Northeast, which is where we live, and the Midwest. And many people from China arrived in California. So if you look at number 3, underneath the second wave, you'll see an illustration of the types of people who arrived from 1820 to 1870. So now let's look at the next slide. The next slide up at the top where it says number 4, we have the third wave of people who are arriving from 1881 to 1920. About 23 million people arrived in the United States. So in the second wave it was 7 million, now we're up to 23 million people arriving in the United States. Many were from Austria, Italy, Hungary, and Russia. People from Japan entered Hawaii and California. So now we're up to the fourth wave, and you'll notice up at the top right, beginning in about 1965, which it seems like a long time for you guys, but really it isn't. Arrivals from Asia and the Caribbean increased, and we know increased means were made bigger. Many came from China, Vietnam, the Philippines, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Jamaica. Americans today, so now down at the bottom, you're going to see that we have a diverse population, and the clothes that they're wearing is more modern and more what we see today. Americans today, there are more than 300 million Americans. Nearly 1 out of every 10 Americans is foreign born. That means they're born somewhere else. Today, the United States is a nation of diverse cultures. That means varied, many cultures. So this is just an overall view of how the United States came to be. It took a very long time, hundreds of years for this to happen, for us to grow and evolve. So you are going to use this information to click on the Google form link below to see how much you learned while listening to the read aloud. Remember, you can go back and listen to the slides again if you need to. You can also go back and look at them. But you are going to click on the link below and answer the questions. Then, when you are done, be sure to mark your Google Classroom assignment done when you have completed it. That way the teachers know that we can go in and check it. So have a great day, social studies students. Bye.